Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme we'll be discussing how we can save a life and how the church needs to engage on the big social moral issues that are dominating our headlines today, especially the sensitive topic of abortion. And in this programme today I'm joined by Dave Brennan from Brephos. Welcome back to the programme again, and a special guest, Major General Timothy Cross, CBE, who's retired. So we've got a great programme ahead of us. I'll start off with you, Dave. It's always a pleasure to have you on Politics Today, and I very much admire the work that you do in educating the church about abortion. But for our viewers, can you just unpack what Brephos does and why it's so important that the church are educated and engaged on this big issue of the day, which is the issue of abortion?
Thank you so much, Simon. Great to be on again. Thank you for having me. I've just got back from Liverpool. We ran a church leaders breakfast there on Friday morning last week. And really the heart of Brephos is to equip the church, and in particular church leaders, to engage this issue. We had a great time on Friday, really gathering together people from different churches in the Liverpool area. And one of the things we looked at is how right from Genesis to Revelation, God loves people and He created us in His image. And there's so much about life in the womb in Scripture, right from the first book of the Bible to the last. It really is on God's heart. The question is it on our hearts as His people in the UK? And all too often, the answer to that, honestly, in this country is, well, no, it's a bit of a blind spot for us. And most of us are not really facing up to this great issue of life in the womb and what's happening to these babies.
Tim, it's a great honour for you to be on Politics Today, particularly knowing your very distinctive military careers as a Major General. Now, many of our viewers might be watching this programme today and think it's very surprising that someone that's been responsible for the defence of the realm and, where necessary, taking life in order to secure our freedom, are now advocating for the protection of life in the womb. Just explain how you've become such a big advocate of Dave and Brephos, particularly, and also this issue of abortion.
Sure. Again, thanks for having me on the programme. I mean, we all carry the baggage of our experiences and we all have our own stories to tell. Mine starts with the fact that I was adopted as a baby back in 1952, 53. I was born in 51. And in today's world, of course, the pressure to have an abortion for a single mum, would have been greater. I don't think my mother would ever had an abortion, but nonetheless, that was my reality. And then when my youngest son was born, my eldest is 48 now, my youngest is 32. My wife and I went to the practice. We were based in Germany at the time, and the nurse, cutting a long story short, the nurse at the time said, well, this is clearly a mistake, so you'll want to do something about it. And when I protested about that comment, she said, this has got nothing to do with you, will you please leave the room? Which I found extraordinary. And then finally my daughter, I have a grandson, special needs grandson called Harry, who we may touch again on later. And when Gemma was pregnant with Harry, it was very strongly suggested that Harry was going to be a special needs and that therefore she might like to euphemistically do something about it. So there are other stories I could tell, but those, three key moments in my life. And it's interesting that we've got three guys around this table talking about this issue, but I want to make the point that this is an issue that men should engage with. It affects us. And I think all too often men are afraid to engage in this issue because they don't quite know what to say. And of course the pressure from the outside world is it's got nothing to do with us, to quote the nurse. Well, it has everything to do with us. So my line is, we need to recognise the reality of what's going on, the brutal facts of what's going on, and we need to be prepared to engage.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you for sharing those personal stories, Tim. And Dave, do you want to just unpack for us God's perspective on the issue of the issue of abortion and why life is so precious to Him? And as Christians, we should actually reflect that and actually speak on the topic of abortion, even though critics of abortion will say, well, you've got three men on this programme discussing abortion, and are not giving a woman's perspective on this topic.
Thank you. Well, right at the heart of the Christian faith, you could say one of the most central doctrines is the doctrine of the incarnation, which states that Jesus wasn't actually born of the Holy Spirit. His birth was natural, it wasn't a miracle, but He was conceived of the Holy Spirit. That is to say, His earthly life began at conception in the womb. So God doesn't just care about life in the womb. He became a life in the womb. And so Jesus experienced life as an embryo, as a fetus, and then as a newborn child. Interestingly, though, in the Greek, in the New Testament Greek, the word used for an unborn child, Brephos in the Greek, is the same as the word used of a newborn. So before birth and after birth, you get this same word used in the New Testament, in Luke's Gospel, for example, chapters 1 and 2. And for me, that really encapsulates how God sees this issue, that there is no distinction. A baby is a baby, and a baby's valuable before birth just as much as after birth. So that's how God sees the unborn, very much as members of the human race. They bear his image, they're precious in his sight, and it was for people that Jesus came and bled and died, to save us, to restore us, to reconcile us to God. So God deeply cares about people, whether they're young or old, beginning of life or end of life, and perhaps we'll touch on that another time. But that's how God sees it, and it's because of that that we should be, as Proverbs 31 verse 8 says, voices for the voiceless. Of all the people groups in the whole of human history, there's been no people group more voiceless than the unborn child. They literally cannot speak for themselves. So it's on men and women to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And I've got colleagues who are women, and they'll say exactly the same thing that I'm saying, which is it's because they're human beings in the womb and they're precious in God's sight. That's why we should all be advocating for them. And of course, abortion doesn't help women either, and perhaps we'll talk about that later as we look at the Abortion Act and so on. But what's good for the mother is good for the baby, and vice versa.
Absolutely. And Tim, share the story how you got involved with Dave here and Brephos and made the issue of abortion an issue very close to your heart as well. And what can the church learn from your military experience? Because effectively, we're engaged in a spiritual war, and we're facing spiritual warfare when it comes to this topic.
Sure, it is indeed. It's a spiritual battle. I had been drawn into the issue as a result of what I said earlier, but over quite a long period of time, and if I'm honest, I resisted it. But I came to realise that actually the Lord was calling me into this. And I started to look at who were the organisations working in this area and trying to find out more about it, and to think through how I could contribute. I come from it from a strategic point of view, a military strategic point of view, if you like. And as we plan a military campaign, we analyse who are the friendly forces, who are the enemy forces, who are the neutrals that we're trying to influence, and how do we bring our combined efforts to bear in this battle. Whether in military parlance that would be things like armour and infantry and artillery and so forth.
And this is the Air Force now.
And the Air Force. But so in that sense, what I started to chat with people and explore was, who are the friendly forces in this? And Brephos clearly is part of that, and CBR UK, but there are others too, and I'm beginning to have conversations with some of these other people. Who are the enemy forces in this? Some of them are quite obvious, but others are not quite so obvious. But understanding who the enemy is and what perspective they bring to this fight. And then the neutrals, largely the media, for example, but also many people who, again, are afraid to tackle this issue because they don't know what to say, they don't know how to engage. So what we've done is we've had a series of meetings, I'm meeting with other people too, looking at who these people are and how we can begin to talk to one another. Because as in so often the case with any issue really, but if you have individuals fighting their own separate battles, you don't bring the combined effort, you don't bring the combined scale to bear. And I do think we need to recognise this is a battle. And there's nothing inevitable about this issue or indeed other issues like assisted suicide. So what we need to have is a very clear campaign plan with the key players understanding who they are, how they relate to one another, how they support each other, as opposed to working against each other, and who are the people that, in military terms, we need to target in this fight.
I like your thinking. Really like your thinking. And Dave, share with us the extent of the crisis this nation faces regarding abortion and why the church needs to wake up, engage in this issue, and as Tim said, actively fight against it. Now, it doesn't mean take our arms, but it means taking up spiritual arms by praying and interceding. And if this means lobbying our members of parliament and others to speak up for the unborn, for not only for the sake of the unborn, but also for the spiritual state and health of the nation.
Yeah, thank you. I really came to know some of these statistics in my early 20s, and this is perhaps above all else what catapulted me into the movement was just learning the scale of this issue. So we're in a situation now in the UK where for every 3 babies born alive, 1 baby has their life intentionally ended in the womb. So that's something like 650,000 babies born alive in the UK, well over 200,000 abortions in England and Wales. So this is not just a few isolated extreme cases. This isn't in sort of medical emergency. The mainstream, the 98% case is this is a healthy mother with a healthy baby, and the baby was conceived through consensual intercourse. So this is the scale. It's absolutely massive, and indeed, if we were to compare with other causes of death in the UK, this is by far the highest. And so this is the scale. And thank you for mentioning really the spiritual impact of this, because I've just been reading recently in the first few books of the Old Testament how the shedding of innocent blood brings a curse on the land. We talk a lot about the environment and climate and so on, and we think a lot about what we're doing directly, as it were, to the atmosphere. But how many of us are asking, well, what have our spiritual and moral decisions been doing to our land and the climate, as it were? And Scripture is clear that whereas righteousness exalts a nation, wickedness, bloodshed, idolatry does the very opposite.
And Tim, if we just unpack some of the statistics, I got this from the government's statistics that was updated a few days ago, that there were 214,526 abortions for women who reside in England and Wales, the highest number since the Abortion Act was introduced in 1967. This was in 2021, and this was during the COVID pandemic lockdown. These numbers are quite frightening, aren't they?
Well, I think they are. On average, about 1,500 people die in the UK for any number of reasons. 2 or 3 are murdered a year. There's road deaths of about 5. 20 or so die from suicides. One of the biggest killers of young men, actually, in this country is suicides. 40 or so from diabetes. Around 80 from Alzheimer's. A large number from cancer and from respiratory diseases, from things like smoking and so on. About 450 a year. But as Dave has just said, and using the analysis of those figures, around 575 abortions every day in this country. I mean, hugely bigger than all of those other figures I've just quoted. I think people are often afraid to face up to the brutal facts of what's going on, because they find the scale of this mind-boggling. If David Steele, when he passed the Abortion Act in 1967, if somebody had said to David Steele, you do realise that within 30 years, 10 million abortions would have happened in this country, I think genuinely David would never have believed that would be possible. And these safeguards that were put in place and so forth are now largely ignored, and so the scale of this is huge. And it's partly, I think, played into by the celebrity culture. I mean, one's got to be careful about, at the end of the day, we must bring, as Christians, we must bring grace into this, not any condemnatory attitudes and so forth. But I've read and heard and been on media programs where, for example, and these are real examples, somebody said, I took longer to think about the colour of my kitchen cupboards than I did about having an abortion. Somebody else said, I had my children early in life, the abortions came later. It was a very natural thing to do. I had somebody say, the only moral choice is to put a pillow over the face of a disabled child. I mean, these are staggering comments, and yet they're played through the media, through the celebrity culture, and they're messages that people hear. And so we do need to speak out about the scale of this. Words like sin and evil are not interesting theological words to me. I mean, I've watched the mass graves being dug up. I've seen what people do to each other on a battlefield. We need to recognise what we're doing to the unborn children in this country.
Absolutely. And when it comes to the debate around abortion and the issue of pro-life, Dave, it's wrapped up in time of nice, friendly language such as healthcare and healthcare emergency, and the true realities are not presented. Is there not a danger that a woman who's pregnant, who's contemplating having abortion, doesn't really know the full extent of what she's getting herself involved in and the moral decisions that she has in her hands between life and death?
Absolutely. We routinely hear from members of the public in the public education work we do, online through our education work in that arena. We routinely hear from women saying, if I'd known this, I wouldn't have had my abortion. They were not told the truth. No one showed them the reality of the life in their womb. No one showed them the reality of what happens to a baby during what we call abortion, which itself is a euphemism, really. So absolutely, women are often kept in the dark, and deliberately so, because the abortion industry, as with so many injustices, it thrives on keeping the reality concealed and hidden. And healthcare is possibly the very worst of all these euphemisms, because actually abortion's an anomaly. To my knowledge, it's the only procedure that's available free on the NHS, which rather than alleviating pain or suffering or preserving life and health, does the exact opposite, because it ends a human life. And of course, it isn't good for the mother's health either. So it isn't healthcare, and it's simply dishonest for it to be described as such. But of course, many women and girls will naturally take what the doctors say as authoritative, because they're meant to be there to tell you the truth and to look after your health.
And Tim, if we go back to the kind of government statistics on this one, do you think that what we're seeing really is the consequence of the breakup of the family and reflects the kind of moral state of the nation? And this is not making judgment, I'm just purely going through statistics. So it said that 82% of abortions that were carried out in 2021 were for women whose marital status was given as single, a proportion that has remained roughly constant for the past 10 years. 49% were women whose marital status was given as single or with a partner.
Yes, I mean, again, like all statistics, one needs to be careful how we interpret them. But I think as part of this goes back to something I was saying earlier. For many women, they feel alone in this conversation. They're without a husband, in the traditional sense, and often without a male partner who, if they're involved at all, will often put pressure on the women to have an abortion because they don't want to be tied down in that relationship. We do live in a world that is much more individualistic. I mean, that's just a reality. People tend to feel that they're in control of their own lives and they will make their own choices and so on. I think, but for a lot of women, they face this problem alone, and they're facing people who are telling them that it will be fine and it'll all be done and dusted pretty quickly. So I think again, men need to engage in this. Men need to take their responsibilities in a much greater way. Absolutely. And we must be compassionate and graceful to people. So in the church, for example, I know for a fact there are lots of organisations, and a couple in particular, that will sit with women who are pregnant and talk to them about the options and about supporting them. And one of those options should be, if you want to have this baby but you can't afford it, we will help you, we will find homes, we will help you financially and so on. We've got to give people alternatives and allow them to have that choice. And I want to go back to Dave's point, or your earlier question about healthcare. Again, forgive me, but I go back to my own experience. My grandson, who was born disabled with special needs, is now 22. I mean, he is an incredible young man. He's got an incredible vocabulary. He's just published his first book.
Amazing.
So when people say, this child, this baby is disabled and will be useless and no good, etc., 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 put pressure on the women to not bring this life into the world, they don't know how these babies will grow and develop and what they'll turn into. I was with Harry this weekend, actually, he lives on the Isle of Wight. He is an extraordinary young man. And thank the Lord, my daughter didn't even contemplate not having Harry. So it's not about healthcare, it's often about convenience, it's about timeliness. And again, one's got to be careful about being in any sense condemnatory, but for a lot of women, having the baby could be something that dramatically affects their career. And they say, I can't do this on my own, this is not the right time for me. And because the system doesn't support them in that conversation and in that debate, that's why we end up with the best part, well, it's about 250,000 babies who are aborted every year. So it's, again, an extraordinary figure.
Well, thank you for bringing the personal context to this discussion, which is really welcome and so important as well. And Tim, we need to engage in the kind of political realm, because this is where this real battle and fight is actually taking place. So according to a kind of recent news report, the all-party parliamentary group on sexual and reproduction health in the UK has argued that we need to decriminalise abortion and treat it as healthcare, a matter to get rid of attached stigmas. Share with us what essentially that means and the agenda that's going behind the all-party parliamentary group on sexual and reproduction health, and how that they want to so-called decriminalise abortion?
Well, really, it's an attempt to totally reframe what abortion even is. There's a reason why, technically speaking, abortion still is treated under the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, because the unborn child is a person, and abortion ends the life of that person. And that's why it still technically exists within that legal framework. And of course, those who provide abortions, those who are supportive of abortion, don't like it sitting there. They would rather, and you'll hear quotes along these lines, they would rather it was treated more like getting a paracetamol from a pharmacy, or even from Boots, from Tesco. They would rather it was something just so simple over the counter, because it reframes it. And as they said there, they want to take the stigma entirely out of it and pretend that this isn't ending a life, that it's just a healthcare procedure. Of course, it isn't. But by rebranding it as something that's much more like going to the dentist or having your appendix out, it changes the way people think about abortion and normalises it even more. But it also, importantly, gives more confidence to those who are providing abortions, because the fact that technically it still exists within this kind of criminal law can produce a cooling effect for those who would otherwise go into that industry. And the abortion industry does find it hard to find people who are willing to perform abortions. Oftentimes they actually just bring them from overseas rather than training them up here, because people don't really want to touch it. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is that it is technically still a criminal act. And what happened in ’67, the Abortion Act, was really to provide a list of exceptions to that rule, whereby you could perform an abortion without fear of punishment. But everyone knows that it's an act, it's a pretense. Abortions are being given out on demand. No one is ever denied an abortion. And they tick the boxes and 2 doctors have to sign off. But everyone knows we've got a situation where it's already on demand. And now those who are part of the abortion lobby want to enshrine that in a new legal system where this is just between a woman and her pharmacist.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can, we don't want to dwell into this other arena, but this is exactly the same debate that's happening in the assisted suicide conversation that was going on in 1967. If you read Hansard and all the things that were being told at the time, and those people who talk about safeguards in assisted suicide need to look at what is happening in places like Canada, in places like Holland and elsewhere, because these safeguards are, valueless after a period of time. And it's not because people are evil people wanting to bring this about. Many of them genuinely believe in this. But ultimately, I think we have to win the battle of ideas, if you like. We have to win that battle space by sharing and showing that these safeguards will not hold over time. And there are now 250,000 abortions every year. And of course, what happened during the pandemic was abortion tablets being sent through the post. That will be increasingly the way that abortions are conducted, with all of the downside and potential tragedies that will flow from that. And alongside 250,000, there'll be tens, if not hundreds of thousands of assisted suicides.
But Tim, looking at the kind of the wider scope of this, won't historians be looking back at this time of where the West committed suicide? And effectively what I mean by that is that we have been destroying our Christian civilization, and the one key indicator with that would be abortion. And because of abortions, we now have a multi-faith society. We need immigration from lots of different countries to make in the workforce, because we're not producing our own force, and therefore we're destroying the very spiritual fabrics of what made this nation great.
Well, there's lots of issues in what you've just said. I mean, I think first of all, we do need to ask ourselves, who would these 10 million babies have been? Who would they have become? They would have become soldiers and politicians and economists and bankers and teachers and nurses and doctors. Huge array of professions that they would have become. Now, abortion's not new, but the scale of it, I think, is what we're talking about here. But I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable that this will continue, as I don't think it's inevitable that assisted suicide will come in. The will to fight is the most important factor in war, and a collapse of morale can bring down an army faster than any virus. But stubborn courage can be equally infectious. And what we have to mobilize are morally courageous people who are prepared to stand up and speak into this issue.
Absolutely.
And recognise that people will have different opinions and they will come at this from different perspectives. But nonetheless, when we open up this conversation in the way that we've attempted to do this morning a little bit, then we will, I think, it is not inevitable that this will continue in the way that it has been.
You only have to look at the Roe v. Wade and the role of the Supreme Court in the United States to say that this is possible. We have about a minute and a half left of the programme, Dave. So do you have a message for any of our viewers watching that are thinking, any viewers that are thinking of having abortion or have had that painful experience of going through abortion and are kind of living with that guilt and regret?
Thank you. Well, my message really would be the gospel is big enough for this. And the reason I'm emboldened to engage this issue with churches and contexts like this is because I believe there is light at the end of the tunnel. The light is stronger than the darkness. And so for anyone who's had an abortion, I want to encourage you, it's not the unforgivable sin. It was precisely for sins such as this that Jesus died. So if you've had an abortion, please reach out. You can get in touch with our ministry that helps people. Just go to our website and we can help you. And if someone's considering an abortion, again, can I just encourage you, reach out, get to know the facts, and there is help and there is hope. You're not alone. We'd love to walk with you through this time.
Tim and Dave, thank you so much for being my guests on this programme, and thank you also for discussing this as well. And I want to thank you for watching this programme at home, and if we learn anything from what Tim has said, then we need to engage in this battle, especially Christian men who can't afford to be silent when we see really what is going on regarding abortion and how many babies have been aborted due to the classification of healthcare. So let's continue to pray for the unborn and let's engage in this righteous fight. And thank you for joining me on this week's edition of Politics Today.